Greetings, dear friends.
Greetings. It's such an honor to have all of you here with us today.
On behalf of the World Council of Churches
and the Global Campaign for Equal Nationality Rights,
we are very happy to welcome you to this anniversary webinar on realizing equal nationality rights for all. The World Council of Churches has a long tradition of upholding and defending human rights for all, especially for those who are marginalized and are rendered voiceless. The plight and lack of attention given to stateless persons is no exception to this tradition. Since 2011, through various conferences and publications organized by its Commission of the Churches on International Affairs, the World Council of Churches has strived to raise awareness about stateless people, their struggles and aspirations. We have especially organized yearly regional training workshops tailored to the specific needs of each context to raise awareness about the stateless people themselves, what they're going through, but with a specific focus on birth registration and gender equal nationality laws. These are activities we have organized as part of our Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace. The pilgrimage is an invitation for our constituency to shed light on those who are struggling in the margins, those who are invisible. And due to their lack of legal existence, stateless people live on the margins of margins. And we have therefore made it a priority at WCC to raise their voice and when possible, give them the space to share their plight.
Across the world, we see that the root cause of statelessness is often discrimination. Discrimination on the basis of different characteristics, such as race, religion, being part of a minority group, or as the result of gender discrimination. For example, today there are 25 countries that deny women the right to pass nationality to their children on an equal basis with men. The mission of the Global Campaign for Equal Nationality Rights is to mobilize action to end gender discrimination in nationality laws, to uphold women and men's equality, including their equal citizenship, and as a means to combat statelessness. We also work for reform in the approximately 50 countries that retain gender discriminatory provisions regarding the ability of a woman to pass citizenship to their spouse. Over the past 7 years, we've worked with national and international organizations, including the World Council on Churches, to shine a light on the harm caused by gender discrimination in nationality laws, and importantly, the many benefits of gender equal nationality laws to countries as a whole. During today's event, you will hear about the real world harm caused by statelessness, but you will also learn about the inspiring efforts in multiple regions to end statelessness once and for all. Because the truth is, and I've said this many times, this is a man-made problem that can be fixed with the political will.
Today's webinar will be an opportunity to mark the 7th anniversary of the UNHCR I Belong campaign to eradicate statelessness, and also will be an opportunity to mark the 60th anniversary of the 1961 Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness. We are therefore happy that this anniversary webinar will be moderated by a stateless woman, Ekaterina, and will also include other stateless panelists. Their inputs, as well as those of other distinguished panelists, will help us better understand the challenges faced by stateless people and those with unequal nationality rights.
It is my great pleasure to introduce you to our moderator, an inspiring and powerful stateless activist. Ekaterina is co-founder of United Stateless, a national organization led by stateless people living in the United States with a mission to build community among those affected by statelessness, raise awareness, and advocate for stateless persons' human rights. Ekaterina, it is such an honor to have you moderate today's discussion. Now, before I turn it over to Ekaterina, just a few logistical points. One, we have opportunities for the panel to respond to questions from the audience, including after the first round of panelist interventions. So please do post your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom. You are also invited to introduce yourself to our webinar attendees in the chat, but please do remember to post your questions in the Q&A. Also, Ekaterina will give very brief introductions to our amazing panelists, though we will share a link to the panelists' short bios in the chat. Lastly, please do continue the conversation online on Twitter and Facebook We encourage you to use the hashtags #statelessness and equal citizenship. We'll post this and our social media handles in the chat. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll turn it back over to Ekaterina.
Thank you for joining us.
Greetings, everyone, and thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Segma, for your introduction. It is a pleasure and honor to serve as the moderator for today's panel. Having lived for more than 20 years as a stateless person in the US, a country with no legal framework to address statelessness, I can certainly speak to the experience of having no nationality. Statelessness is an isolating experience. And since nationality is a gateway to most basic human rights, for those of us who live this reality, it translates into a host of challenges. What I'd like to bring into focus, however, is that the conversation around this man-made issue that affects millions around the world is not without hope. On my journey as a stateless activist and advocate, I'm discovering that the real change is possible, but it requires solidarity and true and equitable collaboration between a wide range of actors from many layers of society. In light of this, I want to thank the World Council of Churches, as well as the Global Campaign for Equal Nationality Rights, for creating this opportunity today to bring together impassioned individuals who are engaged with the issue of statelessness from several key vantage points. It is with joy and pleasure that I'd like to introduce today's panelists. And please do check the chat for the full bios. Today with us, we have Cristiana Bocalo, who is a stateless activist and is the co-founder of State Free, as well as a trustee of the European Network on Statelessness. Next, I'd like to welcome T. Lili, who, as a single mother, is working to secure Malaysian citizenship for her child, as well as to secure this right for all Malaysian women. Next, we have Bishop Corto Brown, who's the current president of the Liberia Council of Churches and the immediate past president of the Interreligious Council of Liberia. And of course, I'd like to welcome Radha Gavil, who is the senior officer on statelessness in the Division of International Protection at UNHCR. Welcome, Radha. And last but not the least, I'm very pleased and honored to introduce Professor Fernando Varinas, who currently serves as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues, as well as an extraordinary professor at the Faculty of Law of the University of Pretoria of South Africa, adjunct professor at the National University of Ireland, Galway, and Cheng Yu Tong, visiting professor at the Faculty of Law of the University of Hong Kong. I'm so excited for today's discussion and would like to dive right into the first round of questions, with the first going to Cristiana. Cristiana, would you please tell us about your initiative, State Free World, and what inspired you to create this project?
Sure. Thank you, Ekaterina, and thank you also to the World Council of Churches and also for the Global Campaign on Equal Nationality Rights. I'm very happy to be here today, and I'm happy to share a bit around State Free. So I am the co-founder of State Free, and we are an organization that is currently creating a space that is supposed to provide community and belonging to stateless people. It aims to be a digital space in which stateless people and their allies, what we refer to as their allies, being policymakers, civil society actors, activists, and that those people are in direct contact with those who are affected. And I guess in order to understand how that idea developed, it's also helpful to understand my background and context. So I am a person who was born in Germany to West African parents, and I have been stateless ever since. And that is because the documentation of my parents were insufficient. So I was categorized as a person or a child with unclear nationality and have been recognized as a stateless person about 2.5 years ago. And as a person who has been affected by the topic, I also have often been confronted with the situation in which I had different questions and topics I would have liked to address in relation to my status as a stateless person, but I didn't have a place to go to or an avenue to actually address those questions and get the sufficient answer to those questions. So 2.5 years ago, I started what I always refer to as a research journey, in which I try to find out as much as possible about the issue. And while researching, I did understand the true scope of statelessness, which I didn't understand up until that point in time. And I also understood that there are a couple of organizations, and actually a lot of organizations, that are working to improve our rights. And what I was missing as an individual was a space in which all of that information could actually, and all of that knowledge, may it be from experience, but also from just being active in the sector, could actually come together, so that we have a space in which every one of us has access to that knowledge. So with State Free, we're currently aiming to create a space in which we can have the experience of belonging and community, but also co-create that single source of truth that allows stateless people to have the information they need to live their life, but also allows them to be in direct contact with people who are working on the issue, so that the conversation around statelessness is finally also centered around those who are affected by it. And I'm very happy to say that we also now finally have a date for when we will be live as a community. So currently we have a website and people can sign up, pre-register to the website, but we will also be live with the forum on November 15th. So that's when people will actually be able to sign up to the forum and actually communicate with each other.
Christiana, thank you so much. Fantastic. Please do post the links in the chat about this. Incredible. My next question goes to Radha. Radha, in the last 10 years, there has been an increase in the number of states acceding to the 1961 Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness. Can you give us one or two examples of the types of pledges made and the actions already taken by the states in recent years to combat statelessness?
Thank you very much, Katerina. And just before I start, I'd really like to thank very much the partners at WCC and the Global Campaign for Equal Nationality Rights for organizing this event on the 7th anniversary of the I Belong campaign. UNHCR deeply appreciates the commitment that both these organizations have shown to the I Belong campaign and to addressing statelessness. So thank you very much. To answer your question, which is a really good one in this anniversary year, I'd just like to highlight that actually this convention, which is actually quite an old convention, is seeing a bit of a renaissance. We've seen 40 states actually join this convention since 2010, and that's a staggering number when you think about a human rights convention today. You know, how many conventions get that level of ratification in just a decade? So we're really impressed, and it shows the continued relevance of this convention and the belief that states have in it to really address situations of statelessness, particularly childhood statelessness. As many of you will know, and because you asked a question about pledges, we had more than 66 states make more than 270 pledges at the high-level segment on statelessness in 2019. So a really strong showing of commitment to this issue 2 years ago. Now, you're not supposed to pick favorites, and I'm not supposed to pick favorites amongst these pledges, but seeing as you've asked, I think I would really want to point to one made by Kenya. And I'll just quote it. It says, by 2023, to complete legal reforms to address and remedy statelessness in Kenya permanently. And I think that that word permanently is what has really caught my attention, not only because it's words on a page, but because Kenya has really followed through on this action. They're not empty words. And since it made this pledge, it's actually granted nationality to several formerly stateless groups, the Shona, persons of Rwandan descent and Indian descent. And for these communities, this is a permanent life-altering solution and really speaks to the spirit of the I Belong campaign and its goals to end statelessness. In short, I find it inspirational. Thanks.
Radha, thank you so much for sharing that example. That's incredible. My next question goes to Bishop Corto Brown. Bishop, Liberia is one of the 25 countries in the world where there is gender inequality in nationality laws. It is also a country where there are some real issues with birth registrations. Could you talk about a bit about the connection between birth registrations and statelessness?
And thank you to the organizers of this event, the World Council of Churches, and the Global Campaign for Equal Nationality Rights. And I'm glad that the World Council of Churches exposed me to the question of statelessness. Concerning birth registration and the connection with statelessness, as you know, birth registration is the permanent universal recording within the civil registry of the birth of a child. Is that document that establishes the existence of a person. The document is instrumental to ensure and protect the basic rights, of the rights of any individual. So without that document, sometimes it's difficult for you to establish the status of a child. So the visible evidence of this legal recognition of a child is the birth registration, and it's a connection with the efforts to ensure that people are not stateless, because the document indicates the parents, the place of birth, the date of birth, and etc. So birth registration is unfortunately not so systematic in Africa, including Liberia, where the records are ported care of, records on birth, on death, on adoptions, on registration, on marriages, on divorces. So in essence, birth registration is the protection and the prevention tool for statelessness. If we want to, in our part of the world, undermine statelessness, then we have to emphasize universal, birth registration, as that visible evidence to be able to ensure that we can, fight against, statelessness.
Bishop Brown, thank you so much. And I know you've been a real champion of this in Liberia. Thank you for your work. My next question is to Lily. Lily, could you please share how gender discrimination in Malaysian nationality law relates to statelessness, and also speak to the impact this situation has had on your family particularly?
Okay, so in 2017, I delivered my baby in Italy. I'm a Malaysian. I did not return to Malaysia to give birth because I had a miscarriage during my first pregnancy in 2015. I did not want the same thing to happen again. So when I was advised by the doctor not to travel and rest well to ensure a safe delivery, I contacted immediately the Malaysia embassy to ensure that there's no legal complication regarding my child's Malaysian citizenship. Sure enough, they informed me that I will be able to register for my child's citizenship at the embassy, and that was and it would take about a year for the process. The correspondences was via email, and still I have it now. At that time, not a single person told me that it is an impossible feat to give my overseas-born child Malaysian citizenship, and I had no idea of the battles regarding the citizenship I have to face just because I, a Malaysian woman, was afraid of miscarriage again, decided to give birth in Italy. When my child was born, we were told that because my child was not born in Malaysia's soil, so she must follow her father's citizenship or apply for Malaysian citizenship. When the citizenship application was not moving forward, we were forced to let her follow her father's citizenship. It was either that or statelessness for my baby. If I have insist on her Malaysian citizenship and place faith in the system as it stands now, she would have been a stateless child, although both her parents have nationality. Then my marriage fell apart. The divorce was traumatic, but at least I have the full custody of my child. I have lived as a single Malaysian mother in a foreign country. I'm raising my child who does not have the same nationality as mine. My child's application for Malaysian citizenship has not been approved, even though I have been periodically following up with the authorities. She's almost now 5 years old. Without spousal dependence, I'm left with no support system. I wish that I could just return to Malaysia after my divorce is done, hopefully by end of this year. No doubt this means leaving my child behind for fear of her having to suffer more as a non-citizenship in my home country.
Tilili, thank you so much for sharing your story. It takes a lot of courage, what you're doing. Thank you. My next question goes to Professor Fernand. Professor, discrimination in all of its forms is indeed considered to be the major driver of statelessness, whether it's gender-based, religion, race, or ethnicity-based. In most cases, it is the discriminatory practices and laws that create conditions of statelessness. Would you speak a bit more to how statelessness and minority issues intersect?
Oui, merci beaucoup, Catherine. Bonjour tout le monde. So first, please allow me to thank the Global Campaign for Equality, Equal Nationality Rights, and the World Council of Churches for organizing this anniversary webinar, and really for the pleasure and the privilege of joining a very distinguished panel. The main point to retain is that most stateless people overwhelmingly come from minority backgrounds. The best guesstimate, more than 3/4 of stateless come from a handful, and I emphasize this, a handful of minority groups who are intentionally targeted by state authorities, where you have discriminatory, ethnic or religious discriminatory legislation and practices. And in fact, it's quite surprising the extent that a handful of minority groups actually constitute millions of stateless people in the world. Think of the Rohingya minority in Myanmar. They actually represent in themselves almost or around 1 million stateless people of the world. 1 million of all of the stateless people. This is a pattern which happens or reoccurs around the world. The largest groups of stateless people in Europe, for example, are the Roma and Russian-speaking minorities. The largest group of stateless people in the Americas are the Haitian descent minority in the Dominican Republic. And the phenomenon has actually not stopped. In fact, there's a threat of a growing phenomenon of discriminatory legislation and practices leading to, and I emphasize this point, potentially millions more right now of individuals being considered or denied citizenship or considered to be stateless, coming from mainly Muslim and Bengali-speaking minorities in India. So the one aspect, which is perhaps not always sufficiently acknowledged, is that statelessness is overwhelmingly a phenomenon of denial of citizenship or withdrawal, actually, of citizenship involving minorities. And this intersection still remains, I would suggest, insufficiently recognized and addressed, not sufficiently the focus of efforts in order to eradicate statelessness around the world. And this is, I think, a kind of reflection that we need to look at. There is noticeable progress being made in a number of areas. There's always more effort that is needed, of course, but there probably needs to be a greater prioritization here of the main causes of statelessness around the world. And that is discriminatory laws and practices that in fact involve targeted minorities, as I pointed out earlier.
Professor Fernand, thank you so much for making these very important points and your insight. We do have a question from the audience, and it is an anonymous question to all panelists. And the question is, how can governments be convinced to take action needed to end statelessness? If statelessness causes so much harm, what is holding governments back? That is an excellent question. And I'd like to pass it on to Radha. Radha, what do you think?
Thanks very much, Katerina. And
put you on the spot like this.
No, it's very good. I'm finding this format very engaging, and I appreciate the opportunity to respond to this question. It's something that we actually see, you know, again and again, that there are these sometimes quite hidden barriers as to why governments would leave a population or individuals on their territory without a nationality, something which, you know, has an underpinning in international law. Everyone has a right, it's a fundamental right to a nationality. many governments have signed up to many international instruments like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the Convention on the Rights of the Child, conventions that have very high numbers of ratifications, where all these governments have accepted obligations that indicate that they respect the right to a nationality, yet something holds them back from resolving the situations of statelessness that exist. And I can point to a couple of reasons. I think one is that in some cases, and perhaps this is a kind explanation, governments have very little idea of exactly who is on their territory in terms of stateless persons and what the numbers are. And sometimes we've even been confronted with some governments saying, well, we don't have stateless people on our territory. We don't think this problem exists. And this points to the fact that there's limited data. There really is a paucity of data on both the number of stateless people and the situation in which they live. So that qualitative data, which really explains the impact of statelessness. But the good thing is that that is being remedied, and we're seeing better data, more data becoming available, and UNHCR is quite involved in seeing that effort to improve data. I think another reason is that there's perhaps a concern that, particularly where there might be a large group of stateless people, that somehow this will lead to a lack of cohesion in society. Maybe it's a group that's been discriminated against for a long time, and those who are discriminating form the political majority. But I think what we're seeing more and more, as well as an understanding that actually excluding large groups of people from society is, in the longer term, even more detrimental. We've seen in different countries around the world that this can actually lead to civil unrest. You can look at the situation in Côte d'Ivoire, the civil war that occurred there. Nationality issues was really at the heart of a protracted civil war in that country. So I think that it's for us advocates to really explain that it's not in the interests of the individual, not in the interests of the community that they live in, not in the interests of the state in terms of its development goals, to have a population that remains stateless, even if it is for short-term political gain. Thank you.
Radha, thank you so much. That is a very comprehensive answer. Absolutely. Does anybody else want to jump in, any of the panelists, to answer the question of how can governments be convinced to take action needed to end statelessness?
Yes, if I may.
Please, Professor.
Thank you very much. I think what needs to be done, or what could be done in this regard, is to emphasize how many of these cases of statelessness are due to a breach of one of the fundamental pillars of international human rights law, the right to equality without discrimination. And in fact, many of us have already been repeating that. If we believe in human rights at all, it would seem clear that states have an obligation to act in ways that conform with the concept of equality without discrimination, particularly because of the significant, in fact, quite dramatic consequences of statelessness, as we've already heard. I think so therefore there has to be continuing emphasis on this fundamental obligations, legal obligations of states. Some cases, I think it has been made convincingly, particularly in relation to women being discriminated in relation to statelessness, denial of citizenship that they can transfer to their children, for example. That's been going relatively well. I think it needs also to be done much more strongly and with more force, in fact, more emphasis in relation to the main causes of statelessness, which is citizenship denial targeting specific minorities. One of the reasons I think there is an issue, very quickly, is that in many countries there is still the assumption, the traditional belief, that citizenship determination is a matter that falls completely within a state's discretion. That's a very old-fashioned, traditional way of looking at citizenship. It's actually false. Citizenship determination, the choice of who is or is not a citizen, actually is also subjected to international human rights obligations. And I think sometimes part of the problem is that there is this kind of tension between the old-fashioned way of understanding citizenship as falling completely under state sovereignty, and in fact, the importance of emphasizing the fundamental cause of most cases of statelessness, which is the denial of a fundamental human rights, the right to equality without discrimination. Thanks.
This is such an interesting point. Thank you, Professor. And it really, I mean, to what extent are discriminatory nationality laws a reflection of outdated patriarchal or traditional religious ideas of family relations, and where wives marry and then they and their children follow their husbands, right? Should governments and the churches help to address these attitudes, right? And if so, and how? Bishop Tilili, Christiana. Oh, we do have a question for Christiana. Oh yes, I can see Tilili. Yeah, that is right. We are living in the 21st century. Absolutely. It's time for change. A question for Christiana. Christiana, how have you been able to connect with other stateless persons to build your community? Could you speak a bit to that?
Yes, so it's been a journey, I'd say. So when I started this journey of trying to find stateless people, I Googled a lot, and it took a while until I found a very small forum, actually, in which I saw a message or a post from a person who was currently researching around the topic of statelessness. She was not stateless herself, but she was currently doing her master thesis on the topic. So I got in contact with her, and through her, I actually got in contact with the European Network on Statelessness. And we remember that back then, my expectation was that when being in contact with, or when approaching the ENS, European Network on Statelessness, I would then have contacts to all stateless people around Europe. That didn't necessarily happen, but I feel like a lot has changed since then, because actually there have been groups set up and monthly meetings set up, and then it just happens over word of mouth, I'd say. So just speaking about the fact that I'm stateless, because that's something I used to actually keep to myself in the past. I think a lot of stateless people have made similar experiences in which you notice that it's nothing you are proud of, maybe, and it's something you tend to maybe hide. But at that point in which I decided to talk about it, you then get in contact with more people who might know about the topic, and who then actually put you in contact with other people. But we're still very much on the search for stateless people, and we hope that by launching the platform in November, that we will actually be able to get to know more stateless people from time to time.
That is so exciting. Thank you. And as a stateless activist and someone who is on the lookout for other stateless people all the time, I can definitely relate. And I'm really looking forward to seeing this project unfold. Well, this brings us to our next round of questions. It seems like we have questions all around, but to all the panelists, from your perspective, how has the current COVID-19 pandemic affected the situation of stateless persons and heightened their vulnerability? We'll start with Tilili. Tilili, can you speak to this, please?
So it definitely has. It was especially even more difficult for me during the pandemic. For fear of legal status of my child, I turned out actually the opportunity for us to be repatriated free of charge by my country, as my girl will be only given a 30-day visa if she follow me with the repatriation. What will happen to my kid when the 30 days visa was expired in the midst of pandemic? The documentation required to travel is also anxiety-inducing. The burdensome tasks that follow a decision to raise a non-citizenship child in Malaysia during a pandemic as a divorcee burdens me. I would have to connect with my ex-husband to renew her travel documents, all while worrying about our health, whether she will be qualified for vaccination at that time, the risk of contracting the virus, whether we will be able to maintain the permanent visa status of my child in Malaysia. Being a non-citizen in Malaysia is not a forgiving environment, for she will be denied access to healthcare and be treated as a foreigner in my own motherland. It truly takes away our autonomy and opens us up to a mental and emotional abuse. It put mothers who cannot leave toxic marriage due to threats to their child's citizenship in danger, as well, since social isolation and quarantine measures mean that Malaysian mothers and their children are immobilized. I know actually of some Malaysian mothers who had to give birth during the pandemic overseas, who had to make the decision between Malaysian citizenship for their child or staying together as a family. as their spouse were non-citizens. Some of them made the choice to separate from their spouse and suffered postpartum depression, and some did everything they could to go home together just to give birth. But administrative challenges prevented them from doing so. What was a mother supposed to do in this situation? Was she supposed to risk separation from her spouse, to travel home during the pandemic alone just to give birth without guarantee of what she would be able to see her husband again? So it's very sad for Malaysian women.
Lily, thank you so much for sharing that. There's also a comment in the chat from Bina, who shares, as borders closed, it became increasingly difficult for Malaysian women to return to the country to give birth here, which means that these children will be deprived of Malaysian citizenship. So definitely a very layered impact. Bishop Brown, would you speak to the impact of COVID-19 and statelessness?
Where COVID-19 shows us that we're all vulnerable. COVID doesn't discriminate. You know the effect COVID has had on jobs, on food security, on incomes. So I think it's a difficult time for everyone, including people who are stateless, because we are all equally vulnerable. And when you speak in terms of vaccination, the fact that if you are not legally registered within a country, that you may be on the back burner, for any kind of assistance. So, and in these times of, health crisis, governments will want to focus on their citizens. And so, yes, I think that, the situation affects everyone. And going back to the point that Rhoda made earlier, I think part of our experience locally is just going back to the question before, the lack of political will and limited awareness on the question of statelessness, of registration, and the fact that there are those who are in denial, like people who are in authority, people who are in government, who are supposed to help effect the kind of change that is required, in the lives of people who are stateless. Those who are, they're in denial. Some people don't believe that statelessness exists. Some people don't believe, like, she said that people who that they may be stateless people in their countries. So, and then there is the overall lack of the political will to be able to ensure that the necessary actions can be taken, to address these questions. But yes, statelessness makes all of us vulnerable, and it reminds us that there is a need for collective actions to be able to address the plight of stateless persons.
That is a very, very solid point. Thank you. Christiana, can you share with us, in your experience as a stateless person, how has COVID-19 affected you particularly?
Sure. So in my case, I think it's important to understand that I am on the privileged spectrum of statelessness. I have identity documentation, I have health insurance, and I have a job and a work permit. So logistically, I didn't really face any barriers. It was more of a mental issue because, as it was mentioned before already, I did, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, at times when all of us weren't really sure how this would actually progress, I did have play this scenarios in my mind in which I was just asking myself, what if a doctor, for example, would have to decide whether he or they attend to the life of me as a stateless person in the hospital, or the life of a German citizen. And the thing is, even though I'm born in Germany, in the context of nationality or in the context of national identity, it's not me as a person who decides where I belong, but actually the external factor that decides that. So for me, it was more of an emotional and mental burden. And then again, I know that there are people in Germany who don't have identity documentation, who don't have health insurance. And even if they do have, there's this cultural barrier, also language issues, language barrier. So I was sure that when my parents would have needed to go to a hospital, I would have tried to accompany them, but then I know that COVID doesn't allow that, right? So you are kind of forced to go alone. So that were issues that I was just thinking about all the time. And I know that people who face barriers also often refrain from actually accessing the services they might be able to access, because there is this fear of deportation and so forth. So I feel like it's complex to describe, because even though I feel the process was barrier-free pretty much if you had access to digital devices in terms of getting tests and vaccination. But on the mental layer, there are a few issues that then tend to create barriers in the end.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Professor Fernandez, would you speak a bit, in your opinion, what would be the intersectional impact of COVID-19 and statelessness?
Yeah, thank you very much. But as others have already pointed out much more eloquently than I could, not having citizenship can de facto mean not having access or certain right to certain services. And what happens, what has been happening in many cases in relation to the pandemic, is that you have stateless people actually facing greater barriers. They may be fearful of being deported, for example, or of being, they may have a fear, in fact, of public authorities. And quite often, it may be the case, and it is the case in some countries, because they're not citizens, they will have less access, and in some cases even be completely denied kind of assistance or support provided by state agencies in the fight against this pandemic. So I think this is one of the aspects we have to understand, is that when you are dealing with stateless, there is an increased risk, and in some cases this is effectively the case, that they may not have access to vaccines. They may not receive any health or other forms of support, as would citizens. Citizens would, almost as a matter of fact, obviously. And even in the case of international travelers and tourists, these categories can in fact be better privileged than individuals who have no citizenship in some countries. So I think we need to be clear. The stateless are amongst the most vulnerable groups of people in the world right now, and they are prevented, or they can be prevented from accessing basic services and protections, which means that their vulnerability can be, and in some countries clearly is, magnified in times of crisis like this pandemic. Thank you.
Professor, thank you so much. And Arada, could you share with us your insight onto this topic?
Yes, sure. So actually, both last year and this year, UNHCR did a bit of a survey to understand the impacts that stateless people might be experiencing as a result of the campaign. And we actually put out 2 separate reports, and I'll post them in the chat after I've finished speaking. But basically what we found from the somewhat limited information we were able to get, again, because stateless people are often excluded from these information gathering exercises, is the fact that the pandemic was further excluding them from accessing healthcare, a problem that we know existed anyway, from treatment and testing and vaccinations, as well as, importantly, the socioeconomic relief packages that governments were giving out to those on their territories or their citizens. And that was primarily because stateless people were not included in national identification or legal residence. They wouldn't meet those requirements that were prerequisites for accessing these services. Our reports found other challenges as well, and I won't go into them in a lot of detail here, but you can read about them in the reports. There's also been exclusion from vaccine passport schemes, which means that there's a continuing impact on stateless people who are unable to then show, even if they have been able to access a vaccine, the fact that they have it. A lack of information leading to a lack of awareness on mitigation measures. Risks of statelessness actually increasing because at the height of the pandemic in different places, there was a complete stop to birth registration activities. So for certain minority and other communities, the lack of birth registration, particularly if delayed for a long time has led to increases in risks of statelessness. We've also found in some places that there was suspension of statelessness determination procedures and court hearings, so prolonging the situation for people who are within a procedure. And now that there's such a backlog of cases that are beginning to get heard again, stateless people will still have to wait even longer for their cases to be heard. Another area that might not be immediately thought of is the risk for stateless people who are in detention. We know that around the world, stateless people can end up in indefinite detention because often they're pending deportation, and lacking a country to which they can be deported, they end up spending even longer in prison. And even though there have been prisoner amnesties during the course of the pandemic, this has not been applicable to stateless people because they don't have a legal status in the country in which they're often detained to enable that release. These are just some of the wide range of issues that we were able to discover. And the fact of the matter is that the impact of the pandemic continues to be felt, and disproportionately so, by stateless people today.
Radha, thank you so much. I can also speak a bit to this experience as a stateless person and also as an activist from the United States and as a member of United Stateless. One of the projects that we have recently launched is a research into COVID-19 and its impact on stateless persons. And to echo what you just shared, very much the issue of detention is a big one. For stateless persons who are lingering in the US immigration detention centers, the effects of COVID-19 are very severe: overcrowded conditions, lack of social distancing, unsafe, unsanitary living conditions, and improper medical care. All have been reported as an ongoing reality in the detention facilities. And of course, that's aggravated by the condition of statelessness. Additionally, we have seen delays, like you mentioned, delays in registrations and consular services, and particularly in the US, delays in the renewal of employment authorization documents, which has led to people who were working, stateless persons who were working, to lose their jobs. And also pandemic-related delays in consular registrations have resulted in difficulties for children being born to US citizens overseas, and many of them are undocumented because of this added risk of statelessness. So yes, very much so. All right, well, this brings us to the next round of questions, and thank you all for sharing your insights on this very important topic. And the next question goes to Bishop Corto Brown. Could you please tell us about the activities your organization has been involved with to combat statelessness? How do you assess the current outlook in Liberia in addition to that? Thank you.
Thank you. Basically, we're being engaged in three or four main interventions. One is the awareness. I have not heard about statelessness before I went to Addis Ababa to the World Council of Churches, conference in 2016. And it's an experience that is shared by a lot of people. Just about 2 weeks ago, we brought a team from Sierra Leone, to one of our workshops. And the Baptist pastor, said that he hasn't heard about statelessness before. So one of our primary intervention, in Liberia is to provide awareness on statelessness. So we've done that through conferences, through workshops. We set up local networks in about 10 of the 15 counties of Liberia. And those networks are doing on the ground, awareness, in communities, in churches, in different settings, to be able to raise the awareness on first on statelessness and the plight of stateless, persons in Africa. Number two, we engage on trying to address the whole question of gender discriminatory nationality laws. As you know, in Liberia, a Liberian, woman who has born a child to a non-Liberian citizen outside of Liberia, that child is not a Liberian citizen at a certain age, So we've been working with the national legislature, particularly Liberian Senate, to see how we could repeal, that law. And I'm glad that at some point the global campaign for equal nationality rights has also gotten involved. So it's one of our occupation, and it's from that experience that I've made a comment about the lack of or the need for the political will to ensure that that steps are taken to be able to protect people from becoming stateless. The third main intervention of our program is the web registration, awareness, training, and certification. As I speak to you, by December 31, 2021, we will have certificated about 10,000 children, working along with the Ministry of Health and the HRC and sometimes the UNHCR, all these groups. And we find out that, for example, in many of even the villages, the towns, even the urban areas, that the young children, parents are not keen on their children, by registration, and because people are not even aware of the whole question of statelessness. So the first thing we're doing now is engaging what we call the Moderator Union basic, that's Liberia, that's Sierra Leone, that Guinea, and Ivory Coast. So we done the initial pilot training for Sierra Leone to extend the intervention within Sierra Leone, and to also Guinea. We have identified the contact person, and we're working on that for the training, and we're hoping to we've done some preliminary contact within Ivory Coast, in the Danley area. We had a team member visit our area recently. So we're trying to find ways to bring the awareness and the whole question of birth registration for children between 0 and 12 years old to not just Liberia, but within our immediate environment and even beyond. So basically, that's where we are. We train more than 200 what we call in Liberia volunteer field registrars, the DFRs. We train them along with the Ministry of Health, and before WCC invited me for their workshop, that is about 5 years ago. The ministry, the UNICEF have produced about 1,000 birth certificates for the Ministry of Liberia, but they were sitting there out there in the Ministry of Health until we got involved, and we've been able to help raise some awareness, and there's a lot of efforts ongoing now by many of the parties with the Ministry of Health in trying to address the question of statelessness, yes, but also birth registration as a tool for protection and prevention of statelessness.
Bishop, thank you so much for sharing this very important work. And my next question is to Professor Fernan. Now, considering your bird's eye vantage point as the UN Special Rapporteur on minority issues, are there particular global trends that give you concern? And on the other hand, what are you seeing as positive trends? And how can our audience contribute or provide support?
Thank you very much. Now, my answer might initially surprise, actually. I think we should be worried, very worried. And this is because the trend, one global trend that seems to be occurring, is that statelessness is not being eradicated. It's actually growing around the world. As I warned also previously in my annual report actually add 2 annual reports to the UN General Assembly in 2019 and 2020, statelessness is growing. It seems to be growing in some states in particular, and I referred specifically to India, where you have minorities, Muslim and Bengali-speaking minorities more precisely, who are again being targeted for denial of what most observers would say is their pre-existing citizenship. And this is a phenomenon that's occurred in, by the way, with the Rohingya in Myanmar. So now we're seeing there is a political and legal trend that could potentially add millions. And once again, I need to emphasize this. We're talking of millions more stateless people that are being targeted with legislation, specifically, and some would say, or at least intentionally, what we're seeing is a political trend in some countries where individuals who belong to certain minorities are again being demonized and painted as outsiders, not deserving of citizenship. And as an example of this, at the beginning of the I Belong campaign, which actually has done some great progress in a number of areas. So at the beginning of the campaign, we were talking about 10 million people who were stateless around the world. There are all kinds of debates around that figure. It's really a best guesstimate, we have to be honest, but still, it was a rough figure we could work with. Today, actually, we're talking about 15 million. I just want to remind you, there are, in fact, one of the closest or perhaps best guesstimates also currently is that we've gone from 10 million to now 15 million stateless people. And we need to wake up. There's an elephant in the room, and I think that's not being acknowledged enough. On the other hand, and there's on the second point, there clearly has been significant progress and initiatives taken that have succeeded. Just as a reminder, Kenya was mentioned earlier for what is some progress that has to be, in fact, highlighted and encouraged and actually celebrated. There's also Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia, which a few years ago adopted essentially agreed to grant citizenship to anyone who was born on its territory and those who actually might not have been able to demonstrate their citizenship. There was a campaign to actually identify individuals who did not have identity documents or were not recognized as citizens. So Kyrgyzstan has committed and moved towards actually eliminating citizenship in that country. And once again, in terms of the progress, noticeable progress, I think the lead, that there's a lead that could be taken from the example of the efforts, and I would say success, of an organization like the Global Campaign for Equal Nationality Rights, which I think has successfully focused on the gender discriminatory dimension of nationality laws. But I would say that the trend actually right now is not a very positive one if you look at the raw figures, and therefore there needs to be the same type of focus and approach done effectively by the Global Campaign for Equal Nationality Rights that would look at focus on minorities and these growing threats of statelessness for millions more right now. And as a top priority, just an example of something that can be done quite effectively is to focus a campaign or prepare a campaign focusing to address the statelessness of the Roma minority in Europe, for example. Thank you.
Professor, thank you so much for this very sobering and also inspiring answer. My next question is to Radha. Radha, can you please speak a bit more to some of the current trends that we're seeing in the I Belong campaign, particularly UNHCR's increasing recognition and support for advocacy initiatives that are in fact led by individuals and communities directly impacted by statelessness? What, in your opinion, makes these initiatives relevant or important to the success of I Belong's mission?
Thanks very much, Ekaterina, for this excellent question. It gives me great pleasure to answer it, actually, because I've just, prior to this event, come off another event, which was a thematic stock-taking event on statelessness, which aimed to look at the progress since 2019, when I mentioned that so many states and other entities delivered these high quality concrete pledges to address statelessness. So it was an event to really see what progress has been made, but also what challenges lie ahead. And we had actually more than 250 participants on this online event just prior to this one. And as part of our lineup of speakers, we had two stateless speakers, a woman by the name of Sharifa Shakira, who is a Rohingya activist living and working now in Texas in the United States, and someone from your own organization, Ekaterina, your colleague Karina, both of whom spoke at this event. And I can tell you, and it's probably no surprise to anyone on this event, that their presentations were absolutely show-stopping. I had people that the chat was overwhelmed with people saying, you know, these are incredibly brave people who've come forward and told their own stories, but also the stories of their colleagues who are part of organizations like yours, United Stateless. And people were profoundly affected. And on this stock-taking event panel, we had, you know, very high-profile state actors from different countries. We had regional organizations like the League of Arab States, which have a lot of influence in countries, including those that have gender discrimination in their nationality laws. We had regional statelessness organizations. We had a very wide variety of actors, but everyone was completely taken by the voices of those who were most affected by the issue. They really are the ones who carried the event. And so I think what we're seeing is this increase in number of individuals and communities affected by statelessness becoming more actively involved, both in the I Belong campaign, but also in their own efforts to raise awareness about the situation of stateless people and their own situations. Some of you will know about Mahamamo, a formerly stateless woman with Lebanese and Syrian parents, who was unable to acquire the nationality of either because of her parents' mixed religion not being enabling her to acquire either of their nationalities. And she's been an outspoken advocate, again, not only on her own case, but highlighting the situation of others, and including on high-profile platforms like the TED Talk series, which has gotten her a lot of exposure, and the situation of statelessness a lot of exposure. So I think what this really shows, like in any situation of serious human rights deprivation, those who are being deprived of their rights are the best advocates, because they speak from lived experience and they know intimately what the best solutions are. The problem is that their very statelessness can render them voiceless. And that's why people like you, your organization, people like Mahamamo, are the ones whose voices the I Belong campaign should be supporting and amplifying. And I think from UNHCR's perspective, that's something that we very much intend to do for the remainder of the campaign and beyond.
Radha, thank you so much, and thank you for sharing the incredible and hopeful news. My next question is to Lily. Lily, there have been some recent promising developments in Malaysia in the fight to secure women's right to pass citizenship to their children. Would you share a bit about these developments and how civil society played a role, so others might consider how they could support similar efforts in their countries?
So in December 2020, last year, Family Frontiers and 6 mothers actually brought a civil suit in the Kuala Lumpur High Court to grant Malaysia mothers equal rights to automatically confer the citizenship to their overseas born children. After about 9 months, on 9 September this year, the court decided in favor of the mothers. It was a good news, but unfortunately, the government filed an appeal against the court's decision just a few days later for baffling reasons. The case actually gained the attention of Malaysian civil society. There have been many events hosted to discuss this issue so far. Our brave Malaysian mothers voiced out to the need to change our law. They told their story on every platform possible. The community participated in all collaborations with NGOs and influential people. To keep the fire burning, we appear on talk show, issue media statement, to speak to the members of parliament and to cabinet ministers. It is the civil society that raised the awareness of this issue. With such attention, we believe that the decision makers are pressured and must take a stand. We are now actually pushing for a constitutional amendment to Article 14.1b to read together with the subclause 1b and 1c of Part 2, second schedule. We do this to solidify the Kuala Lumpur High Court's decision in September. The Home Minister himself stated that they are looking into the constitutional amendment, and many members of parliament are on our side. We now know that actually since 2018, just now Bina also mentioned this in the chat, out of 2,352 citizenship applications made by the Malaysian mothers, only 21 citizenships were were granted and 31 were rejected. There were other 2,300 applications are in limbo. Clearly, this is a need for constitutional change. So just yesterday, the Parliament selected committees has invited Family Frontiers to speak to them about this as well. As members of civil society, we should really recognize that gender discrimination is not only the woman's problem, but an issue that affects every single family. We can show actually our support through flowing, speaking up, donating to NGOs like Family Frontiers here in Malaysia. With numbers comes strength, and it takes a united society to change the law, I believe.
Lily, thank you so much. Really speaks to that when community comes together, real change is possible. Thank you. Christiana, a question for you. If you had a message for our audience about how they could help end statelessness, what would it be?
I guess that's the million-dollar question. I think that mainly depends on the context an individual person is in. I think something that is true for everyone, regardless of your context of work, is definitely becoming aware of the reality that having a nationality is a privilege in today's world, and that it's not a given. And with this awareness, also listening to the stories of stateless people and listening to what they have been through and what they would need to actually improve the situation. And because with this knowledge, it is important to actually educate also your surrounding. There's no way of solving a problem without it being even seen. And it has been mentioned a couple of times today that the lack of awareness is just simply hindering any improvement in that context. And I guess the likelihood of a person not knowing about statelessness in the individual environment is pretty high. So just sharing the stories with other people, because stateless persons are often also burdened with the need of having to explain their own situation to other people. And yes, it is important that stateless people are part of that conversations, but it can be mentally draining as well. So it would be easier for stateless activists, for example, to do their work if they wouldn't have to also explain exactly why they are in the situation, how the situation could happen, because in the end, it's none of their fault. Those reasons were all made up from an external system, actually. So I guess this is one point, just raising awareness from yourself, but also of your surrounding. And then if a person is in any position of power, and by power I mean working in research, working at the law firm, working in corporate companies as well, and especially policymakers, judges, and so forth, just educating yourself, just looking at how your work actually cuts across the topic of statelessness, and when discussing and defining different structures and changes and reformations, how do those changes actually affect stateless people, and how can we make sure that they are inclusive of people regardless of their nationality? Because I do agree with what has been said. I feel like the trend currently is rather negative, but I also feel that what is happening in the sector is very vibrant and that there's a lot of potential. And as long as we make sure to also strengthen our surrounding with the knowledge, we can also make sure that at least there's more positive pressure from civil society towards politicians to actually deal with this and actually become aware of the fact that they are the ones that need to actually change the systems we are living in currently.
Christiana, thank you so much. We do have a question from the audience to Professor Fernand. Should the existence of a state religion which does not recognize mixed religious marriages prevent children from obtaining birth registrations, leading to them possibly becoming stateless, especially in cases of people from minority religions?
To my knowledge, the issue of citizenship and who might actually be prevented from gaining it, it's not really a religious issue, it's a legal issue. You have different governments, it could be from any kind of religious traditions, but you have governments which for ideological or political reasons or other factors decide to privilege certain individuals of a particular ethnic or religious background and to deny citizenship for those of a different background. So I don't think there's any, I certainly don't know of any particular faith that actually would require a state to act in a discriminatory way in terms of citizenship. I think the two are quite different areas. At most, you may have some individuals who interpret their belief in a particular way, but strictly speaking, it's not a religious issue. It's actually a political, legal one.
Thank you so much. Now, we are getting close to the end of our webinar, but we do have some time for a round of answers, a lightning round. So I kindly ask you all to try to respond to my next question with a brief answer. And the question is, what gives you hope? And Bishop Cortu, we'll start with you. What gives you hope?
I think it's the growing awareness and engagement. The growing awareness and engagement that we have is that there's more and more awareness taking place, and there's more and more engagement taking place. If statelessness will be eradicated, then we have to ensure that there's increased awareness and there's more engagement.
Thank you. Christiana, what gives you hope?
I have to say events and discussions like today. When I reached out to different organizations 2 years ago, I was actually shocked about the invisibility of stateless people in the stateless sector. And I'm very happy that a lot has changed, and that gives me hope.
Thank you. Lily, what about you? What gives you hope?
So every time when the media picks up on this issue, every time it is discussed in a webinar, a conference, or an event, and highlighted by the various NGO, it gives me and all the Malaysian mothers hope. It made me feel like we are actually being heard, and our children do not have to be stateless for even 1 second after the registration of their birth. Being able to speak on an international platform and to share my story in the world is not an opportunity that comes by easily. It takes a hard effort of everyone who care enough of what we are going through, and knowing that I have people who care enough to support me and give me a voice to give me hope. Actually, the community of Malaysian mothers give me hope, as I know that I'm not the only one who's struggling and willing to end the statelessness of our children.
Lily, thank you so much. And Radha, what about you? What gives you hope?
So I've worked on this issue now for the best part of a decade, and I've seen a lot of change, especially in the last, I'd say, 5 to 7 years. And I think the thing that gives me hope is the community of people working on this issue. It's a close-knit community, but it's a growing one. But what's impressed me is that closeness and the care that I think this community has for the issue, because let's face it, it is an underdog issue. It's little known, many people don't care about it, and stateless people are often at the very bottom of the heap when it comes to every aspect of their lives. So I think the people who are attracted to work on it really do care about wanting to resolve it and care about seeing it through to the end. So I draw my inspiration every day from my colleagues, people like Sigma and Catherine, who have also devoted themselves to working on this issue day in, day out. And now I would say, with the increase in your previous question about stateless people themselves, both being embraced by the community of people who are working for them, but being absolutely active agents in their own struggle. That's what gives me hope and inspiration. And I think that there are only good things to come from all of this. I think the momentum is with us all.
Radha, thank you so much. And Professor Fernand, what gives you hope?
Thank you very much. I think what Christiana and Lily just said, greater visibility and awareness, which needs to obviously continue, but that actually has helped. Actually, we need to understand what statelessness involves and the extent that it's actually a huge issue with extremely serious human consequences. What also gives me hope is that there have been great successes. What's happening in Kenya, what happened in Kyrgyzstan. We just also heard what is maybe occurring in the United States. And I think that actually, plus also the progress, the real progress that has been made and the continuing progress that has been made with countries that have agreed to eliminate discriminatory practices against women. I think that's one area that can continue very successfully. And by the way, in relation to the United States, I just want to mention very quickly that in a few days, I'm actually beginning a country mission as Special Rapporteur to the United States. It's been many years since a Special Rapporteur has been allowed to investigate the situation of human rights in the country. I'll be arriving Sunday in Washington, D.C. I'll be meeting a series of high-level officials, and I hope to raise this issue, in fact, and the progress in relation to the statelessness determination process, and looking into that more closely. And hopefully, I will address it in my report and recommendations to the UN Human Rights Council next year, March next year. Thank you.
Professor Fernand, thank you. That was a very hopeful message. And thank you. I cannot help but want to speak to this as well. Being stateless has taught me that hope sometimes feels like a very small thing, like a spark, but it is always there. And sometimes it's just hard to see it right away. Over the last several years, that spark certainly got bigger, as I have had the privilege and joy to work alongside an incredible community of dedicated stateless activists and allies, and of course, being a witness to today's discussion, hearing in your words the commitment and the passion to continue this work towards building the world with less discrimination in it. Yeah, that gives me hope. On this note, I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Cristiana Bocalo, Professor Fernand de Varines, Rada Gavil, Bishop Corto Brown, and T. Lili for your time today and your contributions to this important conversation. I once again would like to thank the World Council of Churches, as well as the Global Campaign for Equal Nationality Rights. And I'd also like to thank our audience members for the great questions. And to close this event with a call to action. The right to nationality is a gateway right to most other human rights, and it needs champions and protectors. Learn about the issue of statelessness and help get the word out. Empower stateless persons to become activists. Join the existing nationality right campaigns in your communities across the world. And most importantly, recognize that it is our shared human responsibility to treat each other with dignity and respect. Thank you all, and have a fantastic rest of your day.
Merci, Ekaterina. Au revoir. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.